Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. In today's episode, we are going to be tackling how to create dramatic drapes and valances for a canopy bed. Before I did anything else, I needed to measure the length that I was going to need for these drapes. And so the way I did that was I measured from the ground to the top, and now I also needed to account for the rod pocket on the top, and then I added 3 inches there. And on the bottom, I added about 5 inches just because I don't want these to just hit the ground. I do want them to sweep out a little bit. For the lining of my drapes, I am using a really beautiful silky satin. And the way I'm going to measure these out and cut them is I'm going to measure the length that I need, cut a little wedge or a little pie shape into that, and then you find the thread and you pull it gently. And that is going to give you a perfectly straight line completely across your fabric. And this way you know each panel is going to be perfectly square. Okay, so the very first challenge I have to deal with is I have this big bolt of satin material and it's the wrong color. And I initially thought I could bring this into the house and dye it in the bathtub, but it's just too much fabric and I need this even. So I actually came up with another system of how to do this, and hopefully you should be able to replicate this at home. I went to my local Tractor Supply and I got these galvanized steel tubs, and something I didn't quite realize until I got home was it's actually kind of dangerous to put galvanized steel on any kind of a heating apparatus. So you really don't want to do that. And so what I ended up doing was actually just boiling water on the stove inside, bringing it out. And I found that so long as I kept the temperature at about 160 to 180, the fabric took the dye very well and it didn't need to be any hotter. After adding a 1/4 cup of vinegar and a 1/4 cup of laundry detergent, I then mixed in 4 teaspoons of RIT dye in powder form in the color Petal Pink. Before you ever immerse your fabric into the actual dye bath, you want to make sure it is soaking wet first. And what this does is it helps the dye distribute evenly through your fabric. After a good amount of experimentation, I found that leaving the fabric in the dye bath for about 10 minutes seemed to be the magic number. And I ended up repeating this process multiple times just to ensure that I was going to get even results. So once I had established that, then I could actually start dyeing the big panels. All right, something I didn't realize happens when you're dyeing batches of fabric like this is that the dye is actually getting pulled into the fabric itself. And so when you pull it out, the water is diluted. And so if you're going to be doing batches after batches, you kind of need to be adding more dye before each new set goes in. To lock that dye in, you want to immerse it in a bath of cold water. And then from there, you can wring it out and hang it up to dry. Something I love so much about having spent the time to learn how to dye big sections of fabric like this is now in the future, I can always dye custom bed sheets to fit whatever color scheme I have going on in any given room. All right, that is all done, and I am so jazzed because it took several weeks to source, experiment, and then actually execute that entire process. But thankfully it all worked out, and now we can actually move on to cutting out fabric for these drapery panels. I thought it would be cute and fun to have the dogs in the room while I did this, and they very quickly made it apparent to me that that was, that was not going to work out. After Tweedledee and Tweedledum were put away, I then went about laying out the fabric as smoothly as possible and cutting this out. With this particular kind of velvet, I didn't have that option of making the little snip and pulling the thread. So I really had to work hard to square this up before cutting it. At the moment, I'm only preoccupied with the length of the fabric. I'm going to get to the width of this in just a minute. But until then, what I need is 8 full panels. Each side of the bed is going to require 2 panels on its own. Okay, let's figure out the width of each of these panels. It's really easy. It's just going to be equal to the entire width of the space that you're filling. And what that does is it ends up gathering really beautifully on each side and is really even. The panels that are going to go at the foot and the head of the bed ended up needing to be about 60 inches wide. And so the fabric I had was 60 inches, so I didn't have to do any additions to that. But for the panels that went on the sides of the bed, the space there between the banisters was about 84 inches. So I actually had to cut extra fabric and attach it to this. And then once I've done that, I need to make sure all of the edges are sealed up with a finishing stitch, just to make sure that nothing starts to fray. Let me share a really important tip with you, and that is before you start sewing your panels together, double check and make sure that the fabric is all flowing in the same direction. Because with most materials, and especially velvet, if you hold it in this direction and then you flip it around this way, it can look like a completely different color. So if you take the bottom of one panel and sew it to the top of another, it'll look like 2 different fabrics together. So you want to avoid that. So just double check before you start your sewing. Something that I think is a little important for you to know is anytime I tell you, like, don't do this, it is always because I did that thing. And I have done this specific mistake multiple times on a bunch of different projects, to the point that it has been cemented in my brain now to always check the direction of the fabric. So just keep that in mind anytime I'm telling you, don't do this. It's because I've done it at least once and been very sorry about it later. I'm currently just sewing 2 panels together to make them extra wide for those sides of the bed. And then once I've done this, I'm just going to go around and finish the hems on all 4 sides. I'm now going to create the rod pocket at the top of each of the velvet panels. I'm only creating this pocket at the top of the velvet ones, and I'm going to be actually attaching the satin lining just below this seam. So the way I'm doing this is I'm just folding it over 3 inches, pinning it, and then once I've done that across the entire top, I'm just going to run a stitch through that. Now to add a little bit of a decorative rucheted effect on the top of this rod pocket, I'm just doing 1 single stitch that's about 3/4 of an inch down from the top. And then once you've got your rod through that lower pocket and this gathers together, it's just going to create a nice pretty ruffle at the top. I'm now pinning that satin lining just at the bottom of the rod pocket, and I'm doing this sort of inside out, and then once I run the stitch through and then flip it over, it's going to be seamless and just look really beautiful. I am only attaching the lining and the exterior together through this top, and I'm not going to be stitching down the sides just because I don't want the fabric to sort of lay in any kind of an odd way, because I did experiment with it and saw that wasn't going to work out. And so that's my reasoning for only stitching across the top, and then both of the fabrics can just sort of fall as they will. I'm now going to add a strip of tassel trim to only the 2 interior sides of our panels. And what this does is when they are pulled apart, it creates this incredibly beautiful Victorian look. And if you skip this step, I don't think it will look quite as elegant and dramatic. So this is definitely something to splurge on if you do tackle this project. I'm now ready to hang my panels, but before I can do that, I actually need to cut down these rods that the bed came with. They were done in such a way that they were so long you couldn't actually remove them. So that doesn't really work. So what I've done is I've just trimmed them down enough, and then I'm going to add springs inside the pockets for each of them. So that way, when I have the fabric on the rod, I can just sort of wedge that in there and the tension will hold it in place. I set this up to be pretty tight, so it's going to take me a little bit of finagling to get this in there, because you definitely don't want it at all too short, because you don't ever want this thing to come loose and fall down. Once they were all hung, it was now time to just add the curtain tie backs. And the way I did this is I just looped them through. And then I spent just a good amount of time finagling and adjusting them just so that they laid really beautifully. All right, the draperies are done and I'm so happy with how they turned out. And now it's time to move on to our valances. The type of valance that I wanted to create was a little bit more dramatic than anything that I had kind of delved into in the past. And so I was so unsure about how I was going to do this that I actually ordered a pattern for a valance online. And I got it to the house and I sort of unfolded it and started looking at it. And I remembered, oh, I don't like using patterns because generally they tend to be very modest and not sort of dramatic enough for what I'm into. So I basically took that as a stepping stone and then ultimately designed my own pattern. And that is what I'm working with here on butcher paper. So if you are interested in this pattern, I am going to be making it available to the second tier and up. The thing that intimidated me the most before starting this valance project was, how do you figure out the width of your pattern? And the truth is, it kind of comes together like an accordion, and you end up having a lot more wiggle room than I initially anticipated. So one size can actually fit multiple widths of openings. Right now I'm creating a valance for an area that is 80 inches wide, but if you need this to be adjusted for your own space, if you want to make it smaller or wider, then you just take the swag pattern and you widen it or shorten it depending on what your need is. And the other parts of the pattern can stay the same. Once I had all of my pattern pieces cut out, then I could begin joining them with pins. And then once that was all done and everything was looking nice and smooth, then I was able to actually start stitching it together on the sewing machine. All right, so just like the draperies, our valances are going to be lined on the back with our dyed satin. Now the satin and this velvet is very floppy and kind of prone to distorting their cut patterns. So getting them to lay together smoothly is a serious challenge. So just so you know, a note for the future, if I were to do this again, I would either want to use fabrics that were a little sturdier, kind of more stable, or at the very least use the exact same kind of fabric, possibly just dyed in 2 different colors. The satin was by far the most difficult to work with just because it kind of just kept wanting to twist and bend every which way. And in addition to that, it was super expensive and I had only purchased so much, dyed so much. So I knew if for some reason I ran out, I would be in a real pickle. When it was finally time to start joining these two layers together, that's when I realized how difficult this was going to be, just because they kind of, like I said, kept wanting to move around. So I would pin them, lay them down, see how they were laying. And then there were so many times that I had to unpin, repin, just to get it all right. But once I had sorted all of that out, I just ran it through the machine just on the bottom hem first, because that's the most important. And then once I had done that, I laid it down smooth and flat and then found where it was laying perfectly and then pinned it at the top and then sewed that area. After it was all sewn together, I was able to flip it inside out and then just press it all, and that's when it actually starts kind of looking like something. So before tackling this project, I didn't really know what valances were typically attached to. And it turns out it's typically just a flat board. So really, really simple and uncomplicated. So now that we know that, all I have to do is prepare a board to start pinning my fabric to. I think this was actually about the easiest part of this project because all you have to do is hold the board in place, mark it just a little bit under the space that you need. And then once you've done that, all you have to do is cut it. So my friend Gonzalo Plaza sent me something called a razor saw that I had never used until this particular part of this project. And it just cuts through wood like butter. So this is, I think, maybe one of my favorite new tools. You're going to want to be able to pin things to this board and remove them and pin them again. And so that's why I am covering it with a fabric, just to make that process a little bit easier. Now that my board is prepped, I've actually clamped it onto a ladder so that I can work at it at eye level. And now I'm going to measure and make little markers with pins, the quarter mark, the half mark, just so I have a reference to sort of jump back and forth to on either side. Let me share two really helpful tips if you do decide to tackle this project. And the first is, it's the way that the fabric lays that is paramount and most important to anything else, more important than any measurement or anything like that. So just making sure that it's looking beautiful. And then the second tip I can share is, so long as you keep your number of pleats even, so if you do 7 pleats on this side, it needs to be 7 pleats on that side. And if you just follow that rule, the end result will look beautiful. This is another part that I thought was going to be really complicated, but once you kind of figure out what you're supposed to do, and it's pretty intuitive with the way that the fabric is cut, that you just have to keep fiddling and fiddling until your pleats look right to you. And so I would do a whole little set, and then I would do the opposite side, end up liking how the opposite side looked more, and going back, undoing all of the pins on the other side, and trying to do my very best to mirror both of them. Getting the pleats on the swag section of the pattern to lay correctly was honestly the most tricky part of this. And I would do them, stand back, realize they didn't look right. And the reason I think they gave me so much trouble is because there was that satin lining on the back. So I would fiddle with them endlessly. And then after, I don't know how long, they did start to actually look really beautiful. And as soon as they were looking perfect, I just brought out the staple gun and locked them in place. Steaming the valances was one of my very last steps, and I cannot stress enough what a difference this step made, because it just kind of took them from looking like homemade drapes to something that had been professionally done. To add one more bit of Victorian flair, I am stitching some tassels along the bottom hem, and this actually had to be done by hand because if I had tried running it through a sewing machine, it's lined on both sides, so that would have created a line on the back. It wouldn't have looked very pretty. So a little bit tedious to hand sew, but I think it was worth it when it was done. I'm now ready to tackle the back side of our valances, and I'm actually going to be lining these in just that dyed kind of beigey pink fabric that we did. And the way I'm doing this is, instead of using all of these different parts of the pattern, I'm only using one section and just varying the sizes from large to small. So in the center we'll have kind of a big swoop, and then on the sides we're just going to do some smaller swoops. The method that I found that worked the best for hanging the swag was to first pin the edges and then pin the center. And by the way, that center should be flat and smooth. And once you've done that, then you can actually just start building up your pleats slowly from the inside out. The bottom just wasn't quite looking finished enough, so I did take some of this braided trim and stitch that on as well. To affix this to the actual bed frame, I'm going to need to actually screw it in directly, and I need to pre-drill a hole first, and if I didn't do what I'm doing right now and I used a pre-drill, it would just twist the fabric and ruin it. So what I'm doing is I have two sacrificial pieces of wood clamped on both sides, and hopefully this will stop the fabric from moving at all while I clear that path for a screw. Now that this piece is ready to go, my very last step is to put it in place, pre-drill once more just so I don't split the actual bed frame itself, and then put in that final screw. Okay, our sides are all done, and I am so happy with how they look. I feel like they just turned out so elegant. The reason I wanted to make this episode was because it took me so long to figure out how to do all of these different pieces. And I had to go to so many sources to get my questions answered. And I wanted to create an episode that sort of addressed all of the things that I didn't know going in. So I hope you've enjoyed it. We will be having patterns come out for these valances that's for the second tier and up. So look forward to those. And then next month we are going to be doing a video that tackles the cap of the canopy. So I can't wait to share that with you. And until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon. I could bring it in the house and do it in the bathtub. You don't look at you. Look at, he's sneaky.